on Sky News Australia. This is the Rita Panahi Show.
Good evening and welcome to the Rita Panahi Show. I'm Caroline de Russo. The great Rita Panahi will be back tomorrow, but for tonight I'm in the hot seat. And here's what we've got coming up on the show. The ABC spends big on marketing and advertising, but is anyone actually watching? Media writer Sophie Ellsworth examines how your money is being spent on junk shows and rubbish ads, and what is being done about it. Meanwhile, the project empathises with a breastfeeding mother who was asked to leave a comedy show. But during their interview, some panellists became frustrated with the disruptive baby. Now, who's in the right here? That polarising story's coming up. Sam Berridge joins me to cut through Chris Bowen's self-serving narrative about the very stable energy supply we apparently have. And we cross live to London, where Jeremy Clarkson's farm is warning the world about just how damaging red tape is on the agricultural industry. Is this something we can learn from here in Australia? But first, let's bring in media writer for The Australian, Sophie Ellsworth. Sophie, we all pay for our dearest ABC, yet for some reason they also advertise. Now, you revealed in The Australian that advertising has increased markedly. How on earth is this justified?
Well, Caroline, it's certainly a contentious issue. My story revealed that in the March quarter, the ABC spent $6 million on advertising, promotions and audience research, and about $3.8 million of that alone, Caroline, was on advertising just in the last quarter. This is a lot of money. I think many Australians would be concerned that the ABC is spending to advertise itself, and many would argue that they don't need to advertise. We pay for their content regardless. So why are they pouring millions of dollars every month into audience research, promotions and advertising? And is it necessary? So this data is quite concerning and shows that there has been increases in the March quarter compared to the previous March quarter. So I think if they're going to be transparent about this too, Caroline, they need to publish these figures in their annual reports, which they no longer do, and these figures are only able to be obtained via FOI.
Well, that's not really good enough. They absolutely should be more transparent. But do we know if this advertising actually works?
Well, Caroline, if you go on their figures, they just last week I wrote a story that their radio audiences are diminishing. They had radio audience falls in their three key markets in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. And we know that their TV audiences are also falling. So you could argue perhaps this isn't working, but I think perhaps they need to look at their spending and see, because they're always crying poor, the ABC, is it necessary to be spending money on advertising what Australians already pay for?
Entirely possible. Also, the advertising could just be stemming the flow. And, you know, it's not just the ABC, but all broadcast networks are facing challenges managing the changing habits of younger demographics who, as we know, Sophie, skew heavily towards digital platforms. But how stark is that change?
Well, a report came out this week, Caroline, that the audience numbers have declined by 83% in terms of how much, should I say, people are watching content. So teenagers back in 2011 were consuming about 75 minutes a day of TV content, and that has now fallen to 13 minutes. Now, as we know, Caroline, a lot of people have changed the way that they view content. A lot of people are streaming content when it suits them. They're not sitting down with their evening meal and watching programs at designated times. So this is a real challenge for all networks, is to make sure that they can keep capturing these audiences, but also catering for people who don't want those rigid timetables to watch the shows that they love.
And I suppose that's the point going forward. How quickly and easily are broadcast networks adjusting to this very, very significant change?
Well, I would argue that they're adapting to it pretty well, because we have very good streaming services in Australia. Australians love to stream. They will pay for their content. a lot of households have multiple streaming platforms, whether they are paid or free. So I think Australians can adapt. The broadcasters have adapted to it, but this impacts their bottom line too. So they have to keep these viewers, particularly those that other than the ABC and SBS, because they rely on advertising dollars and they need to keep those viewers so that they get the advertising dollars as a result.
Now, on to the furore from over the weekend at the Arj Barker show, and a member of the audience was apparently forced to leave for breastfeeding during the show. Now, that mother was interviewed by the Project, and during the interview, this happened.
I just thought it'd be really nice to do something that I hadn't done in a while, and just sort of get back to sort of a pre-baby me. She's super cranky right now.
Okay, maybe she can go to Dad just for a quick second. But a mum with 3 little kids, I reckon you need a laugh.
Be careful. Okay, sorry guys.
Sophie, as you well know, babies don't have an on and off switch. Sometimes they cry and sometimes they disturb the adults. Is there a substantive issue here, or has everyone just been caught up in a fuss?
Well, Caroline, everyone loves babies to, be out and about with their mums. They should be able to do that. But I would argue at an event, at a nighttime comedy event where, audience pay for their tickets, they go there to enjoy the show. When you have a baby that is making a lot of noise, it's very disruptive to all involved. Now, there's disputing reports over whether this baby was making a lot of noise or not, but I don't think it's really the place that babies are meant to be because it can just be disruptive, like you said. And if you are going to take babies to events like this, you need to be sitting at the back of the room. So if the baby does make a noise, you can quickly escape. But this, I think, there's conflicting reports here, Caroline, of what actually unfolded. But if a baby is making noise at one of these events, I would argue that it's really disruptive for those people who've paid for their tickets to see this event.
Fair enough, Soph. And on to politics. And in recent days, 2 independents have announced a run for the federal seat of Higgins. Apparently, they want a job share a seat in Parliament. Here's what constitutional expert Ann Twomey had to say.
There is a lot of confusion going on here about the interaction between the Constitution and legislation. What about Section 57 of the Commonwealth Electoral Act? It says this: one member of the House of Representatives shall be chosen for each electoral division. Couldn't really be much clearer than that, could it?
So, I appreciate what they're trying to do, but they're taking the piddle a bit, aren't they?
Well, Caroline, in theory, I think it all sounds great, but in practice, I think it's going to be very hard to make this work. And how can you be juggling such a critical role and sort of going, oh, I'm off this week, you pick up the pieces and then I'll pick them up the following week? And I think that's pretty problematic too for constituents who perhaps want to be in touch with their MP and they're not sure which one. Do we prefer the one that there's week one or the one who's on the second week? I think it becomes a bit blurry. So in theory, I think the idea people probably like, but in practice, I think it's very difficult to be able to make something like this work.
I agree. And you also think about when you get to the other end of things and you're coming up towards an election and you want to hold your MP accountable. Well, which one are you holding accountable? Which one do you like what they've done or not like what they've done? Which one are you voting for? I actually think that there becomes very difficult on the other end when you are looking for that accountability in your MP. Anyway, on to the international scene. And as you well know, we've seen a continued escalation in the Middle East. The US is apparently trying to avert a full-blown war. But with Biden's shambolic record on foreign affairs, you only just have to look to the US exit from Afghanistan, along with this week his mix-up of Rafah and Haifa. I really don't hold a great deal of hope, Soph. But what does this effort involve and who's actually doing the heavy lifting here in the US?
Well, you would hope it would be Biden. I mean, he's the man in charge, and his tenure could well be up at the upcoming election. And this, how he handles this, is very critical, Caroline. But we know that there was a lot of issues after those deaths of the aid workers, and whether the US would be wavering in its support of Israel. But look, this is up to Biden to sort of lead here and show that he can, be authoritative in these situations. But I think his track record has shown that when it comes to these tough challenges, he's not always the man you want there in the top job.
Look, I don't have a great deal of confidence, I won't lie. But the fact of the matter is the US are the big kids on the block. The rest of us are all watching this. How do we have confidence in the US when they don't seem to be really sure about their position themselves?
Well, Caroline, that's the million-dollar question. How do we have confidence? And I think whether Americans have confidence in their own president will be shown later this year. But I think many people believe President Biden is not the man for the job. He's not up to being president, and he's not good in these tough situations. So that is the million-dollar question that a lot of people will want answered. But and many people, I think, would argue if President Trump is president, he would handle things quite differently.
I think that's fair. I think he definitely would handle things differently. And speaking of things that would probably be handled differently, we've seen some shocking footage out of Columbia University in the US. Here is a Jewish professor being barred from his own campus.
Back up, please. My card has been deactivated? Why? Can you back up, please? Wait. Whoa. Everybody, my card has been deactivated. This is Cass Holloway, the COO. This is Gerald Lewis. They were in the meeting where I asked them if Hamas is a terror organization, and they couldn't say. I am a professor here. I have every right to be everywhere on campus. You cannot let people that support Hamas on campus and me, a professor, not go on campus. Let me in now.
So if the professor makes a really good point here, he should be able to go anywhere on campus. It's not a crime to be Jewish. What happens next here? Who's taking responsibility for this?
Well, this is the problem, Caroline, with universities across the world. We've seen many people at these universities become activists. And I think it's really concerning, like you say, that he can't just go about his business without being attacked by this. And I think it's a sad state of affairs when our universities can't all live in harmony and operate in harmony and carry on like that. And I think there's really got to be a clamping down on it. But this is a pretty sad state of affairs, unfortunately, Caroline.
It is really sad, Sophie, because if this was happening anywhere else in the broader community, I think people would struggle to get away with it. And this leads me on, I suppose, to, is there a broader question here around whether our tertiary institutions, are they fit for purpose?
Well, Caroline, you certainly would hope that they are fit for purpose, and they need to come out and, condemn this type of behaviour. It's not okay to be attacking people like this, but that footage just says it all, and it shows that these universities are, they've got a problem with activism on campus, and they need to deal with it quickly and appropriately to make sure that people can get on with their daily lives.
And just one last thing, Sophie, where's the political courage? Where is the political will and the moral clarity that we expect to see from the US on something like this?
Well, it's not there, Caroline. That's pretty obvious. And again, the US has their issues right now, and that's why we've got, obviously, with this presidential election coming up, things could change quite significantly if there is a change of president.
Yeah, perhaps it's just an absolute cluster situation, as they would say. Sophie Ellsworth, thank you as always for your time. Joining me now is Fund Manager and Commodities Analyst Sam Berridge. Sam, thank you for joining us. We know security of energy supply is a pressing issue across the country. Here in WA, the Cook Labor government has told gas suppliers to get moving on idle gas fields. If only it was that easy. In your view, what are the biggest impediments to the exploitation of those gas fields?
Hi, Caroline. I think the key challenges are twofold. I mean, firstly, gas companies, or any company for that matter, just craves certainty and stability. So if you have a stable, approval regime for these projects to work through, then that would be a big step. I mean, you can't have projects which require, thousands of people to be mobilised for their construction stopped halfway through due to a sort of a never-ending process of appeals for a project which has already been approved. So, certainly that's part of it. But, this leads into the next question, which is on cost and economic viability. When you have uncertainty, that invariably leads to higher costs. And if a higher cost project is less likely to be developed than a lower cost project, and Australia might have a rich mineral endowment, but we certainly don't have a monopoly on minerals around the world, and capital is mobile. So if we can't provide a stable regime for which companies can invest in, then those investment dollars are going to go elsewhere.
Absolutely, and I suppose we've seen that to some extent with lithium in recent months, but there are still a number of things which can be controlled in, I suppose, a domestic political environment. Do you think that there is the political will within the Cook Labor government to try and overcome and smooth over some of these potential issues?
They can try, but the offshore gas projects that Roger Cook was referring to, they lie in federal waters, so they can certainly lobby the government. And I think Roger Cook has been very realistic in acknowledging that there is a potential shortage of gas in Western Australia if we don't have more projects coming online to replace the supply that's rolling off. I mean, that's certainly a start, but I think that. Whether or not that will to improve the project approval process is matched by his federal counterparts is another question.
Speaking of federal counterparts, and Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Chris Bowen, he continues to spruik his green energy plan. Now, this was my favourite part of his opinion piece in The Fin yesterday. He said, "A potential comparative advantage is huge. More sunlight hits our country than any other country on the planet. Our wind is above average. We have abundant vital minerals." Now, Sam, we keep being told by the government that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy available, despite warnings from industry that we will all be paying more. Perhaps Chris Bowen doesn't quite know what a comparative advantage means. Now, look, no doubt the plan is ambitious, but is it even achievable or desirable for that matter?
I don't know if it is achievable, and I'll go through the reasons why I say that. So, I mean, firstly, just on this point that renewables are cheapest, I mean, that's completely different to a renewable energy system. Chris Bowen relies heavily or leans heavily on the CSIRO Gen Cost report to make that statement. But just to be clear, like this report assessed costs from the point of view of an investor. And they made a clarification on that point in October last year. So that's entirely different to the costs borne by the consumer. So an investor doesn't have to pay for the costs involved in transforming an intermittent power supply into reliable 24/7 electricity. So those costs are borne by the consumer, and the consumer is finding out just what those costs mean as the months and years tick by. But I mean, back to your point on whether or not it's achievable, I think there's a limit to how much, to what extent consumers and industry can tolerate, continually increasing electricity costs. We've already seen heavy industry start to shut down in Victoria and New South Wales due to high power prices, and I think there is a limit to the extent that people will continue to sustain these cost increases, and I suspect that limit will be exceeded by current energy policy.
And Sam, don't we leave Australia a bit exposed in an economic sense, a security sense, even just a general societal sense, if we're ideological and careless about any transition away from fossil fuels? I mean, the consequences of getting this wrong are huge, aren't they?
Oh, they're massive. I mean, energy sits right alongside food and water as being critical for modern life. We haven't had to worry about energy prices for a very long time because they've been remarkably stable. But obviously that's all changing now. The next shoe to drop is going to be the requirement for LNG imports into the east coast of Australia to meet the gap between demand and supply. I mean, that gas costs 50% more than the current price of gas on the east coast, and that's going to be flowing through to energy bills over the next 12 to 18 months. And so not only is it higher cost, it's also higher emission. So, it really is a lose-lose situation. And so going forward, Australian consumers are going to have to compete with international markets for LNG. And to just highlight what that means, I mean, over in the UK, through the winter that's just gone, I mean, people are limiting the heating of their house to 2 hours a day through wintertime because of the exorbitant cost of power. So, I mean, this is what it means to be connected to international markets, and that comes with higher emissions as well. So, these are some of the consequences of getting energy policy wrong.
Now on to the upcoming budget, and the Treasurer is doing his best to keep expectations in check. Commodity prices have held up the budget since Labor came to power, but good runs, as you well know, don't last forever. How fraught is our immediate economic and budgetary future?
I think in the very short term, we're probably okay, but our position relative, to the rest of the world in terms of, how wealthy we are is deteriorating. The rest of the world certainly seems to be coping with higher interest rates a bit better than Australia is. I mean, here we've got rising housing prices, stubbornly high and stubbornly high and likely to rise further are power costs, and that means higher interest rates for longer. So, that coupled with, some big question marks on ongoing sort of budgetary requirements to fund things like the NDIS, puts a big question mark over how our profitability and quality of life, I think, are going to look like over the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
And do you think the budget is trying to ignore that obvious issue of the additional baked-in operational spend? We don't seem to talk about those sorts of things, but those are the ones that into the future really do impact us.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the world is still subjected to the moral hazard which came with free money for a long time, and no one wants to give that up, and certainly no government wants to explain to their voters that, debt is starting to cost a fair bit. We're going to have to cut back and do more with less. So it's incredibly painful for governments, both here and around the world, to have that conversation. But that's something that needs to be had, and any budgetary decisions which lead to waste, the cost of that waste is increasing with interest rates, and we're going to have to do something about that.
Yeah, we absolutely are. Excellent insights, Cian Berridge. Thank you so much for joining us. But still to come, the government is spruiking a future made in Australia plan. But how dependent is that future on government handouts? And we cross to London, where the alarm has been sounded on red tape in agriculture by an unlikely farming hero. Is there something Australia can learn from in all this? That's next. Welcome back. Joining me now is economics professor Gigi Foster. Gigi, much has been made by this federal government about their future made in Australia policy. I've not met anyone who can use a calculator who thinks it's a good idea to simply create industry dependent on government handouts. Has Labor jumped the shark with this one?
Hi, Caroline. Great to speak with you. Interesting expression, jump the shark. I do reckon it has been done before, but not in this sort of situation. So we have had situations in history, for example, Singapore, where a government chose a particular industrial policy and invested heavily in infant industries in order to bring the society up to an international competitive standard, and then got out of the way and let the market take over. I have not seen that as a a trajectory that the government is planning on this Made in Australia package, which is interesting and quite similar to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act in the sense that the label on the legislation is quite different from the actual meat of the legislation, which really has to do with these quote-unquote green energy handouts. So if I really wanted to believe the government that this is a positive industrial policy to invest in Australia's future in a way that will get us to the frontier internationally of, say, solar and wind production and batteries, then I would see an end game, and that I don't see.
And while this is something a little bit different, I love this Canadian political cartoon from last week, which I think broadly sums up the stupidity of gratuitous government intervention. The taxpayer is footing the bill for all this largesse after all. But relevantly for Australian purposes, a news poll from the weekend shows that voters appear to support Labor's future Made in Australia policy. Now, I note that the poll question commences with the Australian government should actively invest in. Do you think the response from voters would have been different if the question commenced the Australian taxpayer should actively subsidise?
Look, perhaps. I do think that the level of economic literacy in the country is quite woeful, and I'm trying to do everything I can to fix that, but it's difficult. People don't seem to really understand that when a dollar is spent by the government, that's not only a dollar that's coming out of their pocket, but it's also a dollar that doesn't get spent on anything else. So if I were Albo or policymakers trying to invest in things that will really help Australians, I would be thinking about things like bringing clean water to rural communities in the country, how to maybe green our oceans and get plastic out of the oceans, maybe how to invest in the development of drought-resistant crops. There are things that one could do, also building on some of the comparative advantages that Australia has. But I don't see that the green energy package has that. But unfortunately, as you say, a lot of Australians do like the sound of green energy. They just like the idea. I think it makes them feel good. They think they're saving the climate just by believing in this clean energy religion, really. And so unfortunately, that crowds out real discussions, hard discussions, like the one you had with your previous guest, about the real costs and benefits to the Australian people of the various energy investment policy choices that we have on the table.
And do you think that partially perhaps it's a question about education, but do you also think partially it's, I suppose, the consequence of a country like Australia having too much and having had it too good for too long?
Yeah, the lucky country is a curse, right? I definitely think that there's something deep in the Australian culture that leads people to look to government to fix problems when things get really hard. We saw that in COVID, and we're seeing it again now. And indeed, this whole Made in Australia policy has some similar hallmarks to what the COVID lockdown policy had. It says, let's have a big sacrifice, which is higher energy costs and less reliable energy for the promise of some unseen but computer-modeled benefit. And unfortunately, in the case of the COVID lockdowns, that didn't work out so well. COVID came in anyway, and the international literature just accumulates every week showing how bad lockdowns were as a policy. And indeed, they were rejected back as early as 1850. We just forgot about that by public health. So I fear the same for this Made in Australia policy. I wish we could have more sensible, reasoned debates about the costs and benefits of various policy options. But unfortunately, people, as you say, are kind of used to just looking to government, and they can be drawn in by these pretty packagings that the government comes up with. And by the way, Albo came up with the Made in Australia moniker, not just recently, but as far back as June 2022. So it has been in the cooks for quite a while.
Yeah, I wonder whether Australians will work it out at some point. But like I discussed with my last guest, you know, some of this stuff ends up being operational costs baked into the budget well into the future. And if we don't get it right, not only do we have the initial consequences of it, but when this is debt, when there is interest on it, you're suffering the consequences of this well into the future, aren't you?
You're so right, Caroline. And again, that was the same thing with the COVID lockdowns and the JobKeeper policies that followed, all the stimulus. That was one of the main points that I made in the cost-benefit analysis of lockdown policies that I wrote with Sanjeev Sablock back in 2022. We basically tried to estimate the total cost, and you cannot just look at the period of lockdowns. You must look into the future and to all of the things that the government cannot invest in the future because of the fact that they're paying off the debt. But unfortunately, that doesn't appear on anybody's spreadsheet. It doesn't actually materialize. It's basically a future we never had because we made bad decisions. And to really appreciate that, you need to have a little bit of economic understanding, a little bit of sang-froid, a little bit of ability to address policy choices and scarcity in an adult fashion. And unfortunately, I don't see much of that today, either amongst our politicians or honestly amongst some of the people on the street.
Now, on to Tesla, and it's a company which is always interesting to watch. And in recent days, it's slashed the price of a number of models due to a slump in demand. Now, we've become a society which values convenience, and there's a lot of inconvenience associated with EVs. Have consumers removed their rose-coloured glasses finally?
I do think it's possible we could be past peak EV in Australia, possibly. There is obviously a role for electric vehicles in certain areas of the economy, but I think just as you were discussing with your last guest, there's a limit to the fraction of the total market that can economically and sensibly be taken up by EVs. So you may have some people doing it, but as you know, there are many anecdotes now floating around about horrible situations with running out of charge and being unable to charge quickly, or very, very heavy vehicles catching fire on ferries and whatnot. And of course, the maintenance costs, which are greatly higher than a lot of the traditional gas-fired or diesel-fired engines. And because, those things really matter to consumers. It's not just the sticker price. It is the convenience. It is the ongoing ability to be efficient in your everyday life. And if you're not efficient, it's not just a case of trying to chase the lowest possible cost. It's a case of having to spend time and energy and money doing things that could be spent on something else. So instead of waiting around 3 hours for your vehicle to charge, you could be reading to your child or taking a course or something else. So again, it's the notion of what do we give up when we spend on this inconvenient and high cost, ideologically driven, I think, investment in a lot of cases.
And the demand for EVs here and elsewhere, look, it's largely propped up by tax breaks and other types of government support. How fragile is this market if that government support is withdrawn?
I think we wouldn't have many sales at all. And it's actually interesting you mentioned that, Caroline, because I think another thing in terms of economic literacy that people forget is that when government comes in and throws money at something in order to get it going, what does that tell you? It tells you that the market didn't get it going in the first place, right? So it should always be a clue that, maybe this area of investment is actually not particularly economic. Maybe it doesn't make sense to do it. And there are plenty of areas where the market has discovered that there are opportunities, like, for example, using AI in diagnosis, let's say. That's something where the private market's quite interested. How about the Australian government invest in that? If we want to get skilled labor and manufacturing and even just high-skill services here in Australia again, why not look to where the market thinks there's an opportunity and then follow that with some time-limited government support? That would be a much more sensible strategy, I think, for investing in Australia's future.
You would think so. You would think so, Gigi Foster. Thank you so much for your time. In recent years, and particularly since COVID, governments the world over have become particularly exuberant when it comes to regulation. And while red tape may suit government and big business, it's a curse for smaller business and those industries which depend on efficiency and productivity to survive. Joining me now from London to discuss this and much more is UK commentator and former UK Labor advisor Lorin Bell-Cross. Lorin, I grew up in regional Western Australia on a broadacre farm. I know how it all works. And I love Clarkson's farm. I love how practical and unromantic it is. And it really shines a light on the aggressive and frankly pointless regulation which is swamping agriculture in Britain. Here is what the great man himself had to say.
Farming 7 days a week for a year on a 1,000-acre farm has generated an income of £144.
Correct. Fortunately, at the moment, we have this subsidy. When that goes...
What's a farmer's going to do? I mean, honestly, what are they going to do? The ones who don't have Amazon film crews following them around and who wants to be a millionaire to top up the income. I mean, what do you do when these subsidies start to go down? And the next time a farmer moans about the weather, put your arm around him and buy him a pint, because he's not moaning about it because it's a bit miserable working in the rain. He's moaning about it because it's crucifying.
Lorin, how do these bureaucrats think we can keep feeding everyone if they continue with their war on agriculture?
Well, you're right, Caroline. And I think what Jeremy Clarkson, whatever you think of him, he's done is really, really bring home the issues facing farmers every day. And also particularly highlighted the somewhat absurd bureaucratic elements that we and farmers and, you know, not just farmers, but everyone in the United Kingdom seems to face every now and then. You know, you have a system that rewards people that block rather than people that want to create. You know, the series details Clarkson's various dramas with Oxfordshire Council and the various layers of bureaucracy that don't permit him to open a shop or restrict his openings of the shop, and just put all these limitations in front of him rather than just allow him to create stuff. Former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, highlighted this. She called her enemies the anti-growth coalition. Her problem is because she lasted less than 50 days in office, is a lot of them were in her own party. You have this absurd system where you end up having, and I'm not making this up, green councils blocking environmentally friendly like wind and solar farms because of planning permission. It's frankly ridiculous, and it's going to impact the UK negatively.
Absolutely it is. And look, the agriculture industry here in Australia has historically been an excellent innovator. I always quip that when governments get involved, everything costs twice as much, takes twice as long and is half as good. When and why has industry become so accepting of big government?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's something that across Europe you're seeing a wider issue of it. Across Europe, you are seeing farmers in revolt against what they see as excess government intervention. This is a particularly acute problem in, for example, the Netherlands or in Belgium, where you see farmers descending on their capital cities and demanding more action and demanding they get out of their way and let them carry on and do farmers without imposing all sorts of what they see as excessive regulations in their way. And being over-reliant on importing food from elsewhere rather than supporting their own industry. It's something that is ongoing. It's not quite so bad in the United Kingdom compared to elsewhere in the continent, but it's definitely an issue that is going to be keeping a lot of policymakers wide awake at night.
Now on to something else, and sadly since October 7 there's been continued and rather belligerent pro-Palestine protests, not only in Britain but elsewhere around the world. Here is a clip from a protest in London over the weekend.
You are quite openly Jewish. This is a pro-Palestinian march. I'm not accusing you of anything, but I'm worried about the reaction to you. You've been escorted out of this area so you can go about your business, go where you want freely, or if you choose to remain here because you are causing a breach of peace with
If I remain here, you will arrest me.
Because your presence is antagonising a large group of people, and we can't deal with all of them if they attack you or they because your presence is antagonising.
How is this justified, and how can ordinary Britons have confidence in their police force?
I mean, it's something that is increasingly wearing the confidence of ordinary Britons in their police force, to be quite honest with you. The clip you just showed was of Gideon Falter, who's chairman of the campaign group, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. And what you saw there was a police officer telling a man, because he looked openly Jewish, that his presence could be provocative. Now, week after week, we are told that these are peaceful marches, that there's nothing wrong, etc., etc. But whether Gideon Falter was trying to do a stunt or not to prove a point, that's kind of irrelevant in my view. You have a situation where the police are openly telling someone who is Jewish, your presence here at this supposedly peaceful march is provocative. I don't think that's an acceptable reality that we're in. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, yesterday backed the officer involved in that clip, said that the language he used was clumsy and apologised for it, but that they were trying to protect the individual, Mr. Falter. I don't quite buy this, because I think what you're seeing time and time again in these protests in London is you are seeing individuals who are counter-protesting being arrested on various and then de-arrested for their own safety, because the police cannot guarantee their safety. And I think that the inability to stand up to mob rule effectively is dangerous, because what you're beginning to see in other news reporting is that other police officers are saying, because of the extreme amount of resources we are putting into policing these demonstrations that occur pretty much every Saturday, we are not able to solve real crime that's going on. And that's a huge issue. And I think it's an issue that authorities in this country are going to have to deal with pretty sharpish. I think, fortunately, in my view, we're not as bad as the situations in elsewhere around the world, in particular the scenes in the United States. You know, I'm Jewish, and I genuinely thought that some of the scenes in universities there, particularly in Yale and Columbia, were reminiscent of something out of 1930s Germany. You see just sort of mobs chanting and passionately looking for Jews on campus, and I just find that extraordinary and pretty worrying.
It's terribly worrying, and frankly, it's the job of the police to keep us all safe. But also, where's the political courage in all of this? You know, it's less than 100 years since World War II, and suddenly liberal democracies are suggesting Jews get back in the closet for their own good. Like, how on earth did we get here?
It does baffle me. I think there's a good rhetorical support of people saying, oh, you know, we're going to stand with the Jewish community. That's across political parties, I'd say, both Labour and Conservatives in this country. But in practice, you're still seeing Jews scared to go into central London on the weekend to avoid these marches, these so-called peaceful marches. I don't think that's a tolerable reality for a lot of people. And until someone's able to do something and stop the marches, or say you have to restrict this because this has been going on for as long as the conflict has been raging. You know, these are the same people that were chanting genocide when Israel hadn't even entered the Gaza Strip. This is a scripted protest, and it's designed to intimidate Jews, in my opinion. A lot of it. There's a lot of peaceful people there. There's a lot of well-meaning people there. But I think you can't ignore the key malicious elements, because every single week you will see people waving the most horrific of placards, you know, comparing Israel to Nazi Germany. All sorts of inflammatory rhetoric. And I don't think that's acceptable in a capital city of a major Western city.
No, it's absolutely not acceptable. Thank you so much for your time, Lorin Bell-Cross. Thank you for joining us. Now, still to come, the construction industry is still reeling the effects of a COVID hangover, the results of which are crippling housing supply. And a cladding fire on a high-rise building in Melbourne raises fears that construction companies may be cutting too many corners. That's after this. Welcome back to the show. Now, housing accessibility and affordability, they are huge issues in Australia at the moment. And we keep talking about supply. Well, we can only have more supply when we have a healthy construction industry. Unfortunately, over the last 12 months, we have seen numerous private construction companies entering into liquidation. To discuss the consequences of this, I'm joined by Chairman of Quantum Contract Solutions, Cian Brennan. Cian, lovely to have you on the show. Look, mate, we obviously saw muted levels of corporate insolvencies during COVID. Those have risen markedly in recent months, led by the construction sector. Which policies and practices, the ones implemented during COVID, have contributed mostly to the uptick in those construction insolvencies?
Okay, so before we get into that, we have to understand how the construction industry actually works in real life. So top of the food chain, you've got oil and gas companies, you got the government, you got developers. They want to build something eventually. They contract then to a main contractor. Main contractor wins the project, and then he subcontracts out all of the work to the various different subcontractors. What's key here is that the main contractor, the builders, are kind of like financing companies. So they get a big loan from a bank, and they subcontract out all the work, and then they get paid by the owner of the whole project. And they make their money on the delta between the two. Now, during COVID, we had various different policies that were put in place to promote the industry. And that's essentially what happened. We kind of had a mini little boom in the construction industry where there were lots and lots of projects. A lot of builders won a lot of projects. And what's important is in these contracts, there's one particular thing that's important. It's called liquidated damages. And that means that if you're late on a project, you have to pay back the owner of the project a certain amount of money to compensate them for you being late. And so what we've seen is three different things have happened. Because of materials and because of lack of people, they haven't been able to deliver their projects on time, which means that they got hit with liquidated damages. That's the first thing. The second thing is they haven't been able to complete the work, which means they never got paid for the work, which obviously hits their cash flow very, very hard again. And the last thing is the cost of financing since pre-COVID to now has gone up remarkably. So the interest rates have gone up. All three of those things combined have strangled people's cash flows, and people are going out of business more and more and more.
And look, just on that materials costs and unavailability of trades, that most definitely has contributed. And how significant do you think that is in the way that it impacts through that construction chain?
It's absolutely massive. I mean, for example, if you're a steel fabricator, and so you're buying steel, you're fabricating it, and then you're selling it off. If during COVID you signed a contract that locked you in for a particular price, the price of steel went up during that period almost 60%. You're instantly losing money, or you just can't deliver the work, and that leads into the problem of work not being completed, getting hit with liquidated damages again, not getting paid, and it just escalates and escalates and escalates. Resources obviously are a massive issue. There's not enough people to do the work, regardless of whatever plans you have to build more houses, to do more things. If there's not enough people in the market to do what you're trying to do, then it's just not possible.
And this is obviously a big issue, particularly with those fixed price contracts that were entered into during COVID, prior to obviously the increase in the cost of materials and the like. Now, is this something that will just, as a matter of time, flow through the system? Will it eventually right itself?
So there's two different ways to look at it. There's two different things. One is the materials. So materials is really, it is an economic thing. So if you look at it just from basic economics, there was a supply glut, costs went up, and hopefully with that supply glut being gone now, the prices should rectify themselves, minus the general cost of inflation across the whole country as a whole. So from a materials point of view, I think that will rectify itself. From a people point of view, if there's not enough people, there's not enough more skilled people coming in, there's not enough people wanting to be in the construction industry, then something needs to change, because that's not going to magically happen by itself.
Absolutely. And does the elevated demand from government to complete big infrastructure projects, as you know, we've got a whole heap here in WA, does that place extra strain on the private sector construction?
100%. So the resources are limited. So if you're pulling people over to infrastructure projects and away from housing projects, well, then the housing projects are not going to be built. It's very simple. If there's not enough people to do the work, then the work isn't going to be done.
Now, onto a really interesting article in the Sydney Morning Herald about a cladding fire on a high-rise building that contributed to the insolvency of an architecture firm. I'm just curious here, Cian, how much of this is a supply chain quality issue and how much of this is a management of risk issue?
So what we're talking in this specific scenario is, I believe, aluminium cladding on a skyscraper. So if it was a supply quality issue, what would have happened was we would say, we want this amount of cladding and it needs to be to this spec. And when it arrived, it wasn't to that spec. So in this scenario, that's not what's happened. So the architect in his role is to design the building, to pick out the various different materials and their specifications, and then give them to the supplier, which the supplier did. Then you have the fire engineer who will say, okay, is this going to catch fire based on the drawings and the specification? And then you have your surveyors that are the people responsible to making sure that it was installed, everything has been done as it's supposed to have been done. Now, my understanding is all three of these parties are being sued for their role in it. The aluminium cladding was combustible, which means that the specification, the material chosen by the architect is incorrect. The fire engineer didn't catch it. The surveyor didn't catch it. So it's a risk issue, not a supply chain quality issue.
Fair enough, and I think that those legal proceedings are ongoing, so who knows who's ultimately going to be found responsible here. We obviously don't know at this stage, but it's interesting how something can get from a drawing all the way onto a building and it ends up being in that condition. Look, that's all that we've got time for, Cian Brennan. Thank you so much for your time. And that's it from me tonight. Up next is Newsnight. Good night.